Let me welcome everyone back from lunch to the afternoon session of this year's LEAP conference. My name's Charles Godfray. I'm the director of the Martin School at Oxford University, and I co-chaired LEAP with, co-direct LEAP with Susan, who introduced the conference right at the beginning. It's an enormous pleasure to welcome Mario Herrero, who's an old friend, to join us this afternoon and to give the second plenary lecture. Mario was born in Costa Rica and did his PhD at Edinburgh University, so knows these islands well. He worked for some time at the International Livestock Research Institute, and from there went to CSIRO, where he was the chief scientist on sustainability and was based in Brisbane. And recently, 6 months ago, I think it was, he moved from Brisbane, from the warmth of Brisbane to the chilliness of upstate New York. And Mario is now a professor of sustainable food systems and global change at Cornell University. Mario is interested in general food system questions, how production can be made more sustainable, how we can eat healthier and more sustainable diets. But his work has had a particular focus on livestock. And globally, he is one of the most influential thinkers on the future of livestock, both in high-income countries and in low-income countries as well. Mario has worked in both. If I went through all the things he had done, there would be no time left for Mario's talk. So I do encourage you to go and look at his profile on the conference website, where you'll be able to see a little bit more. So Mario, over to you, and your talk is a sustainable roadmap for the livestock sector. Many thanks.
Charles, thanks a lot. That's very kind of you. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, let me see where we should be. Right. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here sharing a morning or an early afternoon with you. I'm going to be talking about a sustainability roadmap for the livestock sector. And what I would like to do is to actually take you a little bit through the status of where we are at the moment on livestock. And then I'll try to present a dossier of solutions for improving the sustainability of the sector, but then try to focus on how we can actually turn this into a roadmap for helping the sector change. At the end of the day, it's not about the endpoint, which we really know needs to be modified, but it's really about how do we get there. So just to start, well, let's put this into a little bit of context. The context, probably you've examined it already in previous sessions, but we have rampant malnutrition in all its forms. We have the threat of climate change, which is really disrupting all industries, all sectors, and which is basically the existential problem that we need to solve in the coming decades. We have large increases in health issues, especially non-communicable diseases and the costs, which are increasing. And we are transgressing a range of the environmental planetary boundaries that ensure that we can keep living in this planet. So against that background, we've heard many times that the livestock sector is a particular contributor to many of these issues. So let's examine it. Let's see what we can do, and let's see how we can actually change what happens in that sector. Let's start with the demand for livestock products. And this is something that I want to re-emphasize to all of you in the sense that in many cases, we cannot treat the livestock sector as a single sector. We really need to dissect it by the different commodities it produces, by the different species, and so on. And what you see here in this graph is the different the different demand, how demand has changed since 1990 to about 2015 or now. And this is expressed in kilograms. And first, let's take a look at the global level, which is the bottom line. And here you will see the commodities that really have been increasing and decreasing. A salient point here is that on a per capita basis, bovine meat, for example, has been decreasing at a global level. And if you did this analysis from 1961, you will probably find the contrary. But if you do it in more recent times, you see that, yeah, there is a small contraction in demand, and with notable increases only in a few countries, well, a few large countries, China, for example, and Brazil. But in reality, overall, it's basically stagnating. So when we see here that the meat has increased by 11 kilos, we're really talking about pork and poultry products. Pork and poultry products drive the demand for livestock products, and also milk as well. And what you can see here is large heterogeneity in the different regions of the world. Fish also increasing importantly, and fish obviously in China and in Eastern Asia having enormous increases in demand, basically of everything. So this is a particularly important thing, because, well, how are we going to achieve sustainability when we don't see a real contraction across all the sectors? Yes, bovine meat is there, but the other ones are actually increasing, and they will have important repercussions. We see three storylines: pork and poultry, especially growing at an accelerated rate; dairy growing in low and middle income countries, but stagnating in the OECD; and red meats stagnating everywhere. What has happened in terms of the supply? Well, in terms of the supply, we see that even though the meats have been relatively stagnating, the bovine meats, this has led, because of population increases, to significant increases in many places, even a doubling of the total production. And we do see a contraction in Europe in terms of total supply, which is interesting, because it's one of the things that we really need to try to do in the coming years if we're going to keep the sector abreast of the problems of environmental change. We have also here we can see here what's happening with poultry and pork. And again, some of the numbers are very, very scary, astronomical in many cases, what's happened in the last decades. Just look at, for example, Southern Asia, almost a doubling of the total, 800% of increase in the supply. Now, where are we in terms of what this has created? Is that we have a very valuable, very valuable industry. And here, this is the latest valuation, $3.47 trillion in taking into account the animals and taking into account the production of the different products, excluding the value of the land, which as I say many times, it's probably the biggest asset that many of these farmers are sitting on. Cattle still being the primary source of that wealth, but it's significant, and it's very much larger than many of the crops. So this is an important thing that we need to consider, because when we think of reducing the size of the livestock sector, which I think will be needed and inevitable, well, what are we going to replace this wealth with is one of the critical questions that we need to ask ourselves. Now let's move a little bit towards the environmental performance of the sector. In many cases, we know that livestock have been a primary cause of land use change. And what we've seen in the recent times since 1990s, the pasture area has increased about 1%, and global cropland area has increased by about 3%. Why global cropland more than pasture land? Well, simply because we're trying to feed all these monogastrics that will require an increased feed, increased grains, and so on. But, you know, critical to all of this, to what we're seeing, is that the environmental efficiency of livestock has been improving. It's not that, you know, we have here a sector that has stagnated in the way it operates. 62% land are used in comparison to 1961 to produce a kilocalorie of livestock. It produces 45% less greenhouse gases, but we've increased the use of nitrogen very significantly. And this is basically fertilizer for the pastures, for the crops, etc. Part of this has been structural change as we move to more intensive production systems, where we've managed to actually increase the productive efficiency. Okay, now what's happening here? Still, it's very important to think of the ruminant sector as one of the key things that we want to tackle in this sustainability problem. I see one of the critical issues here globally, that the production growth in ruminant meat and milk is still driven largely by animal numbers, with a few exceptions. There is a positive story of sustainable intensification in smallholder dairy, where you see an increase in productivity, especially in highland areas of low and middle income countries, where you see increases in productivity being the main source of production growth rather than the increases in animal numbers. But it's not everywhere, you know. And for beef, obviously, because of the nature of the system, everything is driven by production numbers, and this creates an enormous additional pressure on land and on the use of resources. Why? Because we have the maintenance requirement of the animal as a major tax on how animals are going to be produced. And this can be, in many cases, almost 100%, but up to a 30-40% of the requirements of the animal, which is enormous. Now, what is likely to happen also in pork and poultry? The story is different there. Yes, in animal, it's more a story of structural change. And we have traditionally in the past raised chickens and pork and pigs in backyards. But this has actually changed, and we are now very much in the age where the industrial systems are increasing absolutely everywhere. Here, this is driven basically by increases in income. You see here this very nice relationship that Marius Gilbert, together with FAO, came up with, where the proportion of extensively raised chickens diminishes as GDP increases. And we see this in many of the countries. We see using this kind of relationships, we've managed to have a look at what would be the changes expected in different countries. And of course, you see here, for example, Ethiopia and India, and you see important changes in the two countries, with Ethiopia still by 2040, maintaining a large proportion of extensively raised chickens. But in India, as we observe now, industrial poultry production really taking well, the majority of poultry production in the country. So we did this analysis for the Gates Foundation, who really wanted to know, should we invest in poultry, in smallholder poultry production? Yeah, you know, in the medium term at best, perhaps, and in some selected countries, but not everywhere. And this is really important. It will be industrial monogastric production, without a doubt. And this will lead to a very, very significant demand for grains. It is estimated that by 2050, we will be using more grains for feeding animals than for humans, simply because grain as feed is quadrupling. It's likely to quadruple. And this is basically under the majority of scenarios, but if you see here, the shared socioeconomic pathways 2 and 3 will present really, really large increases in the need for feed. And this is especially in Asia, where the sector is really growing at a really fast rate. Now let's move to emissions. Emissions from livestock. Well, we did this review in 2016. Things haven't changed that much in reality, but you know, if you follow the IPCC numbers, we are really the non-CO2 emissions. We're dealing with 2 to 3.6 gigatons of CO2 equivalents, depending on the source that you get. If you look at total emissions following an LCA approach, which includes more of the categories that you see here, we're talking between 5.6 to 7.5 gigatons. What are the key sources of emissions? Well, basically, enteric methane and feed production, which we know, methane really being the most important non-CO2 gas, 78% coming from cattle. And in terms of systems, it's really the mixed systems contributing the most. We know that there are very significant differences in the emissions intensity for producing these products, and this is from Poor and Nemechek. This is a great analysis just showing how well, the environmental footprints of different products, and you see here beef, as expected, having the largest footprints, especially on greenhouse gas emissions and land use. Depending on the environmental dimension that you choose, this changes in comparison to other products, but still, it's really mostly about how we deal with beef in the future, what we have to really take seriously here. Apart from that, we saw the Poor and Nemechek numbers and many others, but it's also important to consider the opportunity cost of carbon, you know, and here, this is really all about land use and really how, what are the opportunity costs of the land where we actually raise these animals. And in many cases, we are growing beef and dairy in places where we shouldn't. And this is one of the key things that we need to think about in this roadmap. There's the eternal argument that livestock do not compete for land with crops, but the reality is that we actually have ruminants in places where we could be doing arable land, and that is something that has to be addressed in the near future effectively. Now, what are the solutions? We've heard very much, especially in the last decade, a lot about changes in consumption, Probably the most salient example is the Eat Lancet, the work of the Eat Lancet Commission, who basically just told us that we needed to reformulate the composition of what's in our plate, made the vegetables the star of the plate, have a diverse diet, with some animal products, but not as much as we have been consuming. And I'm talking especially from a Latin American and OECD perspective. In other places, well, there is some scope for people in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, Southeast Asia, still to increase the consumption of animal products. But certainly there's an overshoot of our consumption in places like North America, for example, as well as realizing the fact that we don't need many of the protective foods like vegetables, fruits, and nuts that are in many cases not produced in sufficient quantities. But against this background, what we see as part of that study, we did a range of scenarios, and I don't know if Marco Springman is in the audience, but Marco led a lot of this work against the background of a range of environmental dimensions for which we were trying to establish a range of boundaries. So red is terrible, green is good. So just for the record. So if you look at the baseline here, the baseline, especially for greenhouse gas emissions, was red. Phosphorus and the biodiversity loss boundaries were also transgressed, while not yet cropland use and water use. Now, if we continue under a business as usual scenario with current waste patterns and the current diets, we would have ended up in a catastrophe with greenhouse gases really exceeding the necessary boundaries. And this is not even considering a 1.5 degree scenario. So, but what you see here is that just the dietary shift basically created most differences on the greenhouse gas emissions. And this is primarily because the Eat Lancet diet requires that we reduce the consumption of animal source foods. So we would have got rid of the methane, but also very importantly, it would have been a contraction of the land use for the sector. But the key here of these scenarios is that it's only when we really move to increasing yield significantly and do something about waste, trying to halve it and doing the dietary shift at the same time, that we really see the big inroads in all the other dimensions. So at the end of the day, the Eat Lancet report, which many people think it's just about the diet, it's really not. The whole thing is about increasing production, increasing productivity, halving waste, and creating the dietary shifts. Those are the three key pillars. It's not a modest proposal by any means. Just look at the kinds of increases and reductions of the different food sources that we have here. This is a really hard ask for the food system, and especially for reducing red meat production, which is well, it's a pricey commodity. It's a pricey commodity. We really need to see how we're going to deal with that efficiently. There's some ways of trying to achieve this, and one of them is trying to, in many cases, improve feeding. It's the standard, and it's probably the easiest of them all in terms of the supply side, especially in low and middle income countries. If we really move from very, very low productivity to modest productivity, we will be able to achieve very significant reductions in emissions intensities. And if we reduce animal numbers, then we really start, for example, achieving net mitigation. We know that some of these yields are absolutely possible because we've actually taken real data from farms and really compared the baselines for the countries against what the top 10% of the farmers in a similar system are producing. And it's really feasible. And you know, what we're talking is it's moving from 1.5 kilos of milk to probably 3 or 4. And this can be done through relatively simple practices. The key is that you need to have a market to sell the milk. You need to start thinking of cold chains. You need to start thinking of having an additional infrastructure there to realize these different potentials. Otherwise, farmers will not really invest in this. When you put this, when you take this through the global models, this is roughly what happens. And I want to show you the case. Just focus on the red circles. And this is a scenario where you have intensified dairy versus the business as usual. The intensified dairy produces more milk, which is the dotted line in bold, and produces more milk with less animals. Yes, we'll need a little bit more cropland on the land use change because we will need to feed these animals perhaps a few more grains. But this comes with a trade-off that we need lower land expansion on natural land and forests. What's the impact? Well, the impact is that we have, if you look at the red is basically methane emissions. And in many cases, we have a modest decrease in methane emissions, but we have a very large change in emissions from land use change. So it's basically the CO2. It's this land sparing effect that we're trying to effect as we intensify productivity sustainably. So that's at least the theory. There's obviously a range of perverse incentives like rebound and so on that we need to deal with, but certainly it's something that we need to evaluate effectively always. And then we need to also think about how we are going to really create additional mitigation apart from really intensifying the diets. A lot of people have put a lot of emphasis on what it's called relocation of production. And this relocation of production is present in most of the integrated assessment models that we see. And it's a critical component of the mitigation strategies to achieve a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in temperature. Here in this paper by Stefan Frank from IASA, we see this in these mitigation curves. This large mustard wedge is structural livestock mitigation, which is basically moving livestock to places where you can actually grow it better or in a more intensive way. At higher yields and well, also trying to take care of welfare, etc. The consumption side that you see here in this crimson color is basically considering changes in consumption in OECD countries. That's why you see the wedge being smaller than the structural livestock. But this could have a huge mitigation potential in many cases. Much larger than what previously estimated. Of course, it comes with all its logistics problems, but it is something to consider for the future, how to potentially achieve. Some of us got very interested in the diet aspects in terms of technical mitigation. And when I was at the International Livestock Research Institute, you know, we started really playing with what would happen if the world went vegan and so on. And we were just really looking at this just from an emission saving. And that vegan scenario, the first one, is Elke Steffest's 2009 paper, which where they really showed what would be the mitigation if no animal source foods were consumed. And since then, well, there's been a broad range of scenarios tested, but all of these scenarios had a higher mitigation potential than what you had on the supply side. So, you know, being at a livestock institute, I thought, well, you know, this is the time. This is real evidence that there's potential here. We need to challenge these consumption trajectories, and that for us was really a breakthrough, working in all this area. Of course, in reality, this can only happen when you start personalizing the problem. That's why when all the analysis by Mike Clark and David Tillman and a range of others starting to appear, linking this area to the health consequences, we felt, yes, look, this is great, because this is what, if you tell people that the risk of dying from a heart attack is very high if you consume a lot of animal source foods, maybe they'll act more than if you tell them that it's for saving a rainforest. You know, we all have different values and everything, but the reality is that people will act on health more than on the environment in many cases. Then one additional topic that there's still a lot of debate about is what role for grasslands. You know, it's the largest land use system on Earth. And what we see here is a paper from Jinfeng Chang using the orchid model, which demonstrated that if you take the grasslands that are currently utilized by livestock, then you end up with grasslands being a net contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. But if you include the sparsely grazed rangelands, especially in the northern latitudes, then you end up with all grasslands being carbon neutral. And this is quite interesting because although those grasslands are currently not very much used, there's all sorts of plans for using them if, you know, if the climate warms up and these grasslands become a potential source of additional grazing land or cropland, well, we might end up destroying a crucial carbon sink that we have at the moment. And we really need to try to stop doing that through land tenure. Land tenure will be critical. A lot of these lands are still community-based lands. They're relatively cheap in price. So with incentives, you know, there's big companies that can come and buy pieces of this land, but we need to find a way of preventing this kind of thing. At the moment, they're a critical component for maintaining the sinks there. Another recent opportunity that has been where there has been a lot of research on is on circularity. And on livestock, there's some really good examples on how circularity could actually decouple livestock from land. This is some work that Hannah Van Santen led, trying to identify what are the boundaries for circularity. So you see all those pizza triangles, and that's the consumption of protein currently for different regions. And you see those two circles, an inner circle, which represents how much protein we could produce from low opportunity cost lands. And the estimate is about 7 grams per person. Now, the outer ring represents what would happen if we could include all the other waste streams, food waste in all, even from restaurants and others, to feed also monogastrics, like mostly pork. This increases to 23 grams per person per day. If you take that a human needs, say 50, 60 grams, then you're talking that potentially you could be producing, 40 up to 40% of a human's protein requirement with livestock decoupled from land. So it's an attractive proposition where we really need to do more research, because part of the solutions for reducing the footprints lie in how we manage waste in the future. And of course, there's all sorts of things that are happening in other sectors as well. Like, for example, civil engineers treating sewage and producing microbial protein from the sewage. Actually, what ends up coming from these plants now is a totally white powder, like casein, that gets incorporated in concentrates for animals. This is already happening in parts of Europe. And we made an estimate with the Potsdam group that we could reduce the emissions from feeding by between 8 to 10%. That is very significant for a completely new industry. Then there's other things coming up, like algae, and this is from the IASA group as well, demonstrating that we could really have significant reductions in emissions from the livestock sector if we actually included algae as feed in many of the rations for ruminants. Obviously, this was a technical potential. There's still issues around costs that need to be sorted out and so on, but certainly it's something that is gaining momentum. There are issues around regulations in different countries. Now Brazil has approved the use of algae as feed, and Chile has also approved algae as feed, but it's a bit stuck in North America, for example, and in other places. And this is because bromoform, which is the key ingredient causing the reductions in emissions, is a carcinogenic. So obviously people are interested in really ensuring that there's no traces in the animal products consumed and so on. So there's still a bit to go here. One of the critical things we'll need for this roadmap is really trying to address pandemics. Livestock are part of the issue no matter what. And this is just to let you know that we've rolled out a global burden of animal diseases program. Just like we have a global burden of disease program for humans, which has been very successful at monitoring certain diseases and creating important data streams. We have a global burden of animal diseases led by OIE and the University of Liverpool. And this is also funded by the Gates Foundation. We're really trying to estimate what these burdens are and trying to try to attribute the losses by diseases to be able to do much better priority setting of how to tackle this enormous problem. And this includes also some issues related to antibiotic resistance, which is also something that we need to be very much aware. This is what I've mentioned is all things that we've known or had, but there's a lot of new technology coming into the sector. And we've seen, for example, livestock and seafood substitute insects as food or feed. We need to diversify our protein sources without a doubt to relieve pressure. But there's also a range of potential game changers that we will need to start thinking of. And for this, one of the critical things is to really think beyond the obvious. You know, it sounds fantastic, you know, to have insects or to have microbial protein from sewage. But if we think beyond issues of, oh, well, yeah, we can replace soybeans and the Amazon, then we save the Amazon. If we really go a little bit further than that, we find that it's not as rosy as we think. And constructing these impact pathways with a range of stakeholders then becomes fundamental for really understanding where we might end up with perverse incentives, where we might end up with trade-offs, etc., which need to be solved explicitly for these things to really work and for them to be sustainable. The best example that I always talk about is improved pastures in Latin America. Yes, fantastic for increasing productivity, and people were doubling and tripling stocking rates. But the assumption was that they were going to keep everything using the same land, or having some land sparing, producing the same amount of protein from that land. And what really happened is that it was so profitable that farmers chopped more forests to plant more improved pastures to increase their gains. And in export economies, like many of the Central and South American ones at the time, especially in the 80s when this happened, well, this led to devastating consequences for rainforests. We need to ensure that we pick those kinds of things. And it's all in the planning. It's all in the planning. We are incredibly good at talking about the endpoints, and all our studies, there's a plethora of studies telling us what to do. And there's two things. We never say how to get there. We always talk about the endpoint, and we put all these action points to unknown actors. For unknown actors to do. It's all totally unattributed, which is part of the problem. I think that if we want accountability, if we want really a system that will actually work, we need to start assigning who has to do what in all of this. Key to this is equity. There's a lot of issues related to, well, who will benefit from these changes and who will suffer. And it's not easy. It's not easy in any terms, in terms of the diets, in terms of livestock, in terms of all the things that we want to achieve. But it's the critical point for this to work. And we will only do it if we really start taking social systems much more, bringing them to the fore. At the end of the day, it's really about building trust. It's about respecting the different values that we have, knowing from where different stakeholders sitting at the table are coming from. And unless this building trust, unless we understand where we're coming from, we will never find the social license for achieving some of the changes. We want policies to change and regulations, yes, well, but again, let's start thinking of who loses, who wins, and how we're going to do this. That's also the way in which the market incentives will come. Also knowing about how we're going to safeguard against the undesirable effects. And once we have these elements, well, stable finance to coming up with these roadmaps and transitions will start materializing. But it's significant money. If we're thinking of getting rid of more than $1 trillion of wealth, well, we better have a good idea of these solutions. The menu that I showed you will lead to potentially revaluing some parts of the system, which is what we want, not to put all the onus on farmers to have to lose money, because then this won't achieve the fast transitions that we want. So it's something important to consider. Part of this is that we have to deal with internalizing the true cost of food. This came from the Food Summit. And what we see here is that from all the costs on food expenditure, we're still not accounting for 2/3 of them. And in many cases, in this particular study, the health costs were higher than the environmental costs, which is something that's, it's something to really think about. Obviously, we need better metrics, better analysis for solving this issue, but internalizing the true cost of food is something that is definitely coming in, and it's one of the big things in the next for the next decade. How to do this with businesses, how to do this with public procurement systems, how to find ways of doing this in a way that the cost doesn't end up with the consumer, especially in the poorer sectors of society, will be one of the critical things we'll be busy with. And lastly, monitoring and accountability. This is the critical thing. Let's start assigning the actors, and let's all share the responsibility to ensure that we have a more sustainable food system, where with a new redesigned and resized livestock sector, which still has a contribution to make to livelihoods and to the planet in general. Thank you very much.
Mario, thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely fabulous. At the beginning, I described you as one of the world's leading thinkers around livestock and the future of livestock, and I think you've amply demonstrated that. There's some really interesting questions, and I'm really sorry we just don't have time for that. We're right up against the next session, but we'll try and capture those questions and send them to you if you might have time to address some of them. So Mario, okay. Let me thank you again. That was a really super talk. This session will now end, and the next session, which is chaired by Pete Scarborough, will start almost immediately. So many thanks again, Mario, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you.